the state of the division, this time with UFC 312. An overall interesting card, if I'm being honest. I think it's really carried by its two title fights, Tatiana Suarez versus Zhang and Dricus du Plessis versus Sean Strickland. Both are interesting matchups. In the case of du Plessis-Strickland, it's a rematch that was a split decision victory. I think it's a fight that has a lot of potential. I think it can be super interesting. In Welly-Suarez, it's the fight between kind of the old champion, the standard bearer, versus the undefeated up-and-comer. And for the rest of the card, there are some interesting fights, and there's a lot of potential. But I think the big appeal of this card really lies in the outcome of this card. These are a lot of new fighters being put on this card. These are a lot of fighters looking to make the jump up to the next kind of echelon of competition. Fighters looking to establish themselves or coming off a contender series win. It's a lot of fighters looking to make that step that kind of fill this card top to bottom, which isn't a bad thing, but it is a weird thing to try and get hyped about fighters that have a contender series appearance, or fighters that have 3 fights in the UFC but have only been in the UFC for like a year and a half. It makes it a little difficult to really get hyped for this card. I'm still excited. I still think there's a lot of potential in this card. But before we get to that, we can take a look at the housekeeping and the butcher's bill. Now we actually have housekeeping this time, and it's not off to a great start. I went 7-5-1 on the last card. The one coming from Islam Makhachev's late switch of opponents to Renato Moicano. I wouldn't count that against me if Makhachev lost. I won't count it against me if he won. And given that it's not a great start, I want to go over what I think was my biggest mistake, and that was not picking Merab to win. I think I discounted Merab's continuation, his ability to continue his pace, and that high kind of cardio action. I think I discounted that too much looking at Nurmagomedov's ground game where they matched up evenly. And I think they did match up evenly on the ground. I just think Merab was able to maintain a ludicrous pace through 5 rounds that by round 3 he was able to start edging him out, and needing 3 out of 5 to win is something Merab can do. I just think that was my big mistake, and I like going over those after I have a result like this. But we do also have a butcher's bill for this card, and hold with me because it's not a short one. Marcin Perchino is out against Jimmy Crute. He is replaced with Rodolfo Bellato. Ray Saruya and Stuart Nickel are both out of the card after Nickel had to pull out due to an injury. Cody Haddon is out of his fight against Alexander Topuria and is replaced by a fighter I will name later as I forgot to write it here. And kicking us off, 9-0, Peace of Mind, Hyun-Sung Park, looks to stay perfect against 8-1, Art of War, I'm so sorry, Niamjargal Tumedndemerel. He is 3 years younger at 26, a dead draw of height but 5 inches of reach going to Tumedndemerel. I'm so sorry. Park comes into this as the hot hand and is very much a finisher, with 4 KO and 4 submission wins in his career, with 2 of each in the UFC so far. Now, he does have a pretty consistent ground game, a 1.5 full average, and 3 of his 4 UFC fights have him with a landed takedown. I will say the control time isn't too high, with his highest coming off a takedown being about 2 minutes. But his most was 3 minutes in a fight where he had no takedowns and won by KO. But backing that all up is that aforementioned submission game, which he does attempt with regularity. Striking sits a 4-1-5 to 3-4-3, with the KO touch being there with some consistency. It doesn't feel like the swarming style where he overwhelms his opponent, but more like a power shot that can end in an instance. Tumedndemerel is much more of a ground game focused fighter with some submission ability, but is willing to take it the distance. On the ground, he carries a 2.42 average with that submission ability, but also will rack up the takedowns in order to build control time. It's backed by a stereotypical 3.13 to 3.29 striking, highlighting the purely functional nature of it, though he doesn't seem to have any major KO power. Vegas likes Hyun-Sung Park, and I think I'm agreeing off the bat here. Tumedndemerel poses a threat with his ground game, yes. But coming off his fight against Carlos Hernandez, we saw his takedown and ground game get nullified. And if I'm taking a small leap of faith here, Hyun-Sung Park has a good enough ground game to put the pressure on Tumedndemerel and has the ability to take the win. I think he matches up really well in this scenario. He's able to outpace him on the feet, and his ground game looks to be good enough to at least survive or get it back to the feet where he wants to be. 7-1, Killian Salkilld squares off against 7-1, Anshul, King of Lions, Jubil. Salkilld is 5 years younger, dead even height, but 6 inches of reach do rule to Salkilld. Salkilld is coming off a Contender Series win in September of 2024, a unanimous decision with 9 landed takedowns and 4 minutes and 40 seconds of ground control. Outside the UFC, he's been a little bit of an all-rounder with 2 KO, 3 submission, and 2 decision wins. He does have a few first-round finishes, but a majority of his fights go to the 2nd or 3rd round. I'm going to make the assumption he prefers to lead the action in terms of takedowns, given that his submission wins were a guillotine and a rear naked choke. Jubil has a little more experience with 3 total fights in the UFC, and stylistically looks to be a striking-focused grinder with 4 career decision wins, though I have to admit he does have some sort of finishability. However, it is very inconsistent, and he has been caught in turn. His striking is somewhat dynamic, but with only 3 fights, it's a little hard to get a gauge of it. In terms of takedowns, he racks a .82, but only 2 landed in 1 fight in the UFC, and that fight he won by KO. Vegas gives the nod to Salkilld here, and I'm going to agree. I don't really have a lot of data here, and my problem with just rolling with Jubil is that he has been taken down 4 times in 1 fight, and Salkilld is coming off a 9 takedown performance in his Contender Series bout. Salkilld seems to like to shoot the takedowns and will shoot the takedowns, and we just saw Jubil struggle with someone who shot 4 takedowns, now going against someone who was willing to shoot 9 in 1 fight, and that's the landed takedowns. I just think the odds in this fight stack up a little more for Salkilld than they do for Jubil. 7-1, Jonathan Micallef looks to follow up his Contender Series win against 10-3 Kevin Jousset. Micallef is 5 years younger, 2 inches shorter, but does take 2 back in reach. Micallef looks to be a bit of an all-rounder, though he doesn't have a great deal of UFC stats for me to actually look at. But outside the UFC, he works 2 KO, 3 submission, and 2 decision wins. He doesn't seem to be a super quick starter, most of his fights going past the first and ending in the second or third. Looking at his ground game, he seems to be able to play off his back or take the initiative in that aspect. Jousset only has 3 total fights, but seems to be a pretty high-octane fighter with definite finishability. In the striking, he works a 7.73 to 6.92, which speaks to both his high pace and his ability to get caught in exchanges or outpaced in general. There is also a ground game with a 1.05 average that has only shown up in 2 fights, for decent chunks of control time, about 1:25. Jousset gets the nod here, and this is a close one for me. It's a little hard to get, but I think I'm going to take a gamble, and I'm going to go with Micallef. Jousset has the definite advantage on the feet and can finish the fight there, but on the ground, I think Micallef has the slight edge and can take advantage there. Yes, Jousset has more experience, but I think Micallef in this case looks to have the ability to get it to the ground, looks to be able to lead the action on the ground, and while Jousset probably doesn't want to shoot a takedown in this fight, if it goes to the ground, I think Micallef has shown that he can push that advantage well enough to take a win that way. 25-6, Rong Zhu looks for the quick rebound against the newcomer, 7-0, Cody Steele. Zhu is 5 years younger at 24, with Steele either being 2 inches taller or the same height, but Zhu does take a definite inch in reach. Zhu is a killer-be-killed finisher with an emphasis on the striking. Looking at his UFC numbers, he works a 5.45 to 5.80 in striking, which looks bad, but the closeness of the numbers comes mainly from his losses, where he was outstruck handily. In his wins, he takes a striking lead and only finishes in the later round. He does seem a little bit like a power puncher, able to land that one shot and end it, but there are some fights where he seems to resemble a bit more of that swarming style, peppering you with the blows and just putting you away by quantity of damage. Now, his ground game sits at a 1.85, but he hasn't landed a takedown since 2022. He has proven the ability to survive the takedown and get back to his feet, or even reverse position and take the advantage and get some control time. Steele is the complete newcomer here, with only a Contender Series fight to his name, but looking at his career numbers, he resembles a finisher with a tendency for the feet. In that vein, he seems fairly explosive, able to mix it up and throw opponents for a ride. He does also have submission ability, which has cropped up once, but I'm unsure if it was based off him landing a takedown or working off a scramble in some way. Steele receives the nod from Vegas here, and I think I will agree. I think it's close, and part of me wants to pick Zhu. But my holdup is that he's coming off a loss against a finisher who is similar to Steele, at least in the looks. Steele being a pretty high output finisher, who I think can keep up and prevent Zhu from getting the big striking leads he likes to work with in a lot of his fights. I don't think Zhu's going to be able to outpace Steele here, and I think Steele's good enough to either match pace and looks to be able to land enough shots that Zhu might be put on the back foot early and find himself fighting from behind, and that's not a good recipe for him. Ending off the early prelims, we have 2 newcomers stepping into the octagon. 7-0 Colby Golden Boy Thicknesse looks to stay perfect against 5-1 Alexandre El Conquistador Topuria. Thicknesse is 4 years younger at 25, 2 inches taller, and no idea on reach. So obviously we have no UFC stats for either fighter, but starting with Thicknesse, he looks like a bit of an all-rounder. 2 KO, 2 submission, and 3 decision wins in his career, and is also on a 3-fight finish streak. Seems to pack a fairly dynamic striking style, mixing in elbows with the more traditional MMA striking we see, but other than that, I don't have much info on it. Looking at his ground game, he seems to want to be the one to lead the action, with both of his submission wins being by rear naked choke. I don't know about his ability to play off the back, but if I'm making an assumption, he might be decent at it. But overall, when it comes to the finish, he works quickly, with each one of those coming in the first. Topuria is much more of a finisher who leans slightly towards the feet, with 3 KO and 2 submission wins. he does definitely tend to work quickly, with every single one of his wins coming before, or basically at, the 3-minute mark of the first round. His ground game seems a little more varied compared to Thicknesse, with an armbar victory instead of just rear naked chokes. I'll make the assumption that he prefers to lead the action, but can play off his back. In the striking, he seems to be a quick starter, capable of pouring it on quickly and putting his opponents away. The heavy favorite is Topuria, and I will agree. It's a little bit boring, I know, but I don't really have information for these two fighters to look at. And without that, I'm going to kind of trust Vegas on this and hope the casinos know what they're doing. And they generally seem to. So in the end, I am going to go with Topuria, kind of based on the Vegas recommendation, if you will. Starting the prelims off, 6-1, Wang the Joker Cong looks for the rebound against 10-4-1 Bruna the Special One Brasil. Brasil is 1 year younger, either dead even height or 1 inch in favor of Cong, as well as an inch of reach going her way. Cong is a relative newcomer with only 3 UFC fights under her belt, but as a whole I think I would call her a finisher with 4 career wins by finish, 2 KO and 2 submission. Looking at the UFC numbers, she works a 5.81 to 1.63 in striking, which highlights the high octane pace that she can put out. Not to mention that she does have a finish ability, though I am admittedly unsure if it's a power punch or that swarming style. But with consistency, the KO touch does tend to come quick, with each of her KO wins coming in the first. Takedowns sit at 1.16, which mostly comes from her first UFC fight, but either way, she has finish ability on the ground and seems to have the ability to play defensively and survive that position. Brasil is much more of a ground-focused fighter with a 1.93 takedown average and its consistent presence in her fights, with 2 or more landed in her wins. She doesn't seem to have much of a submission game, but the control time is solid and a consistent threat here. Her striking stands at 2.94 to 3.49, which is standard for a ground-focused fighter, really. It's entirely functional and lets her hang in most of her fights. She can be outpaced heavily and has been in her 2 UFC losses, even being KO'd in 1 of them. The heavy favorite is Cong, and I think I will agree. I'm being a little boring here, but my reasoning for picking Cong is that it seems to be more checkboxes land in her favor. On the feet, Cong has the advantage. She's a higher output striker, something Brasil has struggled with, and she has that consistent KO touch. When it comes to the ground, Brasil has a good takedown game and a good ground game, yes, but we've seen Cong both use a ground game, have a submission threat, and also survive on the ground. And while part of me thinks that Brasil might be a little bit better and might be able to take her down and control her, Kong's proven the ability to survive. And if Brasil can't finish her, she steps back into the octagon and Cong has more chances to take the round or put her away. So in the end, I'm going with Cong just because it seems like more checkboxes end up in her favor. 8-1, Tom Big Train Nolan takes on the 8-4-1 Vladislav Slavaclaus Borschev. Nolan is 9 years younger, 3 or 4 inches taller, depending on the site you read, with a definite 4 in reach. Going to Nolan. Nolan comes into this as a killer be killed finisher, with 2 of his 3 UFC wins being by KO and 3 of his 4 fights ending by finish. On the feet, he works a 6.68 to 5.17, speaking to his high pace and his willingness to step in and exchange if the fight goes that way. He does seem to have a dynamic style, mixing an explosive power that can catch his opponents. In terms of finishing, he tends to work quick, with all but 1 of his finishes coming in the first, and the lone exception coming in the second. He does have a submission attempt in the UFC, but does not have a landed takedown, which does show he's able to play defensively in terms of the ground. Borschev has been a bit streaky in the UFC, but as a whole looks to be a kill or be decision fighter. And by that, I mean he either wins by KO finish or the fight goes the distance and he loses to the judges. He has 4 UFC wins, 3 of them by finish, and 4 UFC losses, 3 of them by decision. In the numbers, he rolls with a 5.40 to 4.80 in striking, so he's able to outpace and overwhelm his opponents in the wins pretty quickly and ends the fight in the early rounds. But in the losses, he's proven the ability to at least hang around his opponents and not be completely left behind. The takedown game is non-existent, and he does seem to struggle with the defense, having only a 35%, and it is something his opponents tend to find a lot of success with against him. Vegas has this one close, but gives the slightest of edges to Slavaclaus, and I think I will agree. Obviously, both fighters can win this fight. It should be this close. Both guys are finishers, both guys like to strike, they're both willing to trade. But my reasoning for picking Borschev here is that he's had a lot of success on the feet, and a lot of his losses come from getting taken down and controlled. Nolan doesn't do that. Nolan doesn't shoot takedowns. He doesn't really look for the control game of it all. And if he's going to stand and bang on the feet, I'm going to throw my lot in with Slavaclaus here and kind of put my faith in his power and kind of his track record in his fight so far, standing on the feet and swinging. At the end of the prelims, I think. 13-3, Jack Far Jenkins looks for 2 in a row against 11-2 Gabriel Mosquetejinho Santos. Santos is 3 years younger, 2 inches taller, but then they're 2 inches in reach, also going his way. Jenkins looks to be a bit of an all-rounder with some solid striking plus some finishability, and then a pretty active ground game backing it all up. Looking at the striking first, he carries a 4.83 to 2.92, which shows how he tends to outstrike his opponent. However, it is worth noting that there are some notable exceptions where he outstruck his opponent by 2 and 3 strikes. Obviously, he does have finishability with 2 finished wins in the UFC and 6 total in his career. I will say that it very much reads as the swarming type of striking, where the quantity overwhelms more so than the power. The ground game is another major part of what he does, with a 2.12 average and a constant presence in his wins. Total takedowns and control time does vary, but he uses them to put pressure on his opponent and help drag them into the deep end during the later rounds. Santos has been a bit colder in the UFC so far, with 2 losses and 1 win, but as a whole, I think I can call him a ground-focused finisher who is more than willing to grind. He works a 3.44 takedown average, and it exists as a constant presence in his fights, and he does shoot a lot of them with 11 attempts in 1 of his fights. That control time does vary, as attempts can be stuffed or their effectiveness negated. In that same vein, he has a number of submission wins outside the UFC, but none inside. In the striking, he works the grappler focus 469 to 477, entirely functional, and lets him set up his takedowns and deal some damage. Vegas likes Santos here, and I'm going to disagree. I'm going to roll with Jenkins. Yes, Jenkins does struggle with takedowns, but he has overcome takedowns in order to come back and get the win. He's survived them, gotten back to the feet, and either gotten the points or gotten the KO. And we've seen Santos' takedowns be negated or lessened, looking at his fight against David Onama, who was a power puncher who put him away and survived the takedowns. So I think in this fight, I think Jenkins has the ability, or at least should have the skill, to lessen the impact of the takedowns and keep the fight where he wants it, on the feet where Santos really doesn't match up with him well. Taking us into the main card. 20-7 Jake the Celtic Kid Matthews looks to take his streak to 2 in a row against the 12-2 Francisco Prado. Prado is 8 years younger at 22, 1 inch in height going to Matthews, who also does take 4 inches in reach. Matthews is a little weird to try and peg a style to. He has finishability with 2 of his last 3 wins coming by finish, but his most recent win came by decision, and in his career he has 7 decision wins. Starting with his striking, he works a 3.38 to 2.54. He doesn't work the most ludicrous pace, but in his wins will take the striking lead and keeps his opponents in a hole. In his losses, it's the opposite, where his opponents take the noticeable lead and make him fight from behind. But as mentioned, he has some KO power, though it is a little inconsistent and relies on him being able to work his range well. The striking is backed up by a 1.56 takedown average with a pretty consistent presence in his decision wins. Off of those, he's able to generate consistent chunks of control time when he lands, about 3 minutes. Following that is a submission threat that isn't consistent, but is something he can pull out against most opponents. Prado has been a bit colder in the UFC, with only 1 win in 2023, but stylistically is a kill or be decision fighter, with his 1 UFC win and every career win coming by KO or submission. On the feet, he rocks a 4.58 to 5.66, which highlights his reliance on power and tendency to be outpaced. You see that looking at his last fight against Daniel Zellhuber, where he was outstruck 120 to 90. Obviously, the power is there, but it seems like that at a high enough pace will cause him problems. On the ground, he rocks a solid 0.00 in terms of takedowns, but seems to be able to play off his back with attempted takedowns in fights without any landed. Additionally, his 25% takedown defense does help paint that picture. Matthews gets the narrow nod over Prado here, and I'm going to agree. Prado relies on the finish, but has been controlled pretty soundly in 2 of his UFC fights. And the control game is something Matthews does well. He's very good at limiting the offense, slowing them down, and keeping the entire fight kind of where he wants it to be, which is something Prado, as mentioned, struggles with. And if Prado's not able to overcome Matthews and put Matthews in the hole, Matthews gets to fight from the lead. He's proven he can do that really well. 12-4-1 Jimmy the Brute Crute tries to stop the skid against 12-2 Rodolfo Pretor Bellato. Even age across the board, with Bellato taking 1 inch in height and 3 in reach. As mentioned, Crute has been on a skid, losing 3 of his last 4, and the only non-loss was a draw that he then lost the rematch. But stylistically, Crute is a killer-be-killed fighter with about a dead-even split between KOs and submission. He works a 4.84 takedown average, with them being ever-present in a majority of his fights. With that is obviously the submission threat, but beyond that, he had proven the ability to take chunks of control time and put his opponents in the hole. His striking gives the ground game enough support with the standard 3.68 to 3.04, and it does heavily rely on power to even odds on the feet. In his wins, the totals don't tend to reach that high, where he either ends up with a power punch or limits their offense with his takedowns. But in his losses, you see him still get outpaced, and even with landed and secured takedowns. Bellato is the relative impressive newcomer with an early Contender Series bout that he lost before coming back in 2023 and winning 2 fights by KO. Stylistically, I think it's safe to call him a killer be killed fighter with some serious power. On the feet, sits at a 6'4'7" to a 5'9'0", highlighting the high pace he's able to output in addition to his power. Now obviously with a killer be killed nature, he has a chance to be put away. Additionally, he does work a 1.09 takedown average that can give him recovery or disruption opportunities with additional history of submission wins outside the UFC that he could pull. Vegas likes Bellato here, and I'm going to agree. Admittedly, I debated this fight a lot more than I should have. I always do tend to lean towards guys with UFC experience like Crute, but he's on a 4-fight winless streak, a 3-fight losing streak, if you will, and Bellato matches up fairly well. If Crute goes to the ground, I feel like Bellato can match him, and if Crute tries to stay on the feet, I think Bellato has the edge. Could Crute beat him on the ground with submissions and control time? Yes, but Bellato has that submission history, and Bellato seems to have a pretty decent ground game overall, which I think matches up pretty well with Crute, which leaves the feet as the final deciding factor. And I think Crute comes up a little bit shorter there if I'm comparing the two fighters head to head. I could definitely be wrong here because these guys both are kill or be killed in some way, but I am going to give the edge to Bellato and I'm going to pick him to win. 7-4-0-1, Justin Badman Tafa takes on UFC newcomer 7-0, Tyson Zakao Teixeira. Teixeira is 7 years younger, 7 inches taller, with another 9 inches in reach coming his way. Tafa is coming into this fight off a decision loss, but as a whole is the traditional heavyweight swang and bang fighter who relies on power to put it away in an instant. In turn, he carries a 409 to a 502 in striking, highlighting the reliance on power to even the odds, and how in his losses the totals skyrocket with all of them going against him. In that note, he does do better in shorter fights, with most of his wins coming in the first round, but a good deal of his losses coming in the later rounds. Teixeira is the newcomer with some impressive measurements, but stylistically looks to be a finisher with a preference for the feet. 6 career KO wins. Seems like he has a pretty dynamic style with some head kick KOs on record. I don't have any numbers on the ground game, but he seems to be able to play off his back with an inverted armbar finish on record, that is his only submission win. Teixeira is the recipient of a Teixeira is the recipient of a narrow Vegas nod, and I'm going to agree. Now, obviously, this is a heavyweight bout, and a surprise KO from either fighter is completely possible. But the reason I'm picking Teixeira here is just because Tafa hasn't done anything to make himself stand out amongst the heavyweights. As I said, he's kind of a standard swang and bang fighter. He relies on power, he wades into fire and looks for the shot to put you away, and I just don't know if that's good enough here. So I'm trusting Vegas a little bit, but nothing Tafa has done makes him stand out in my mind as a fighter who's like, he's got this in the bag, he's the upset. Against Teixeira, who has that huge reach advantage, who has the height advantage, if he can use his power to control him, use his size to fight at range, I think Tafa's at a major disadvantage. Because Tafa has struggled with getting controlled before. Even if it's not a takedown, if you can control his offense on the feet, limit what he can do and limit the damage and keep him at range, I think Teixeira just ticks a few more boxes for me in this fight than Tafa does. For the first title fight of the night, 25-3 Magnum Zhang Weili looks for her third defense against the undefeated 10-0 Tatiana Suarez. Suarez is 1 year younger, 1 inch taller, with 3 inches of reach also going her way. Weili is an all-rounder who's capable of bending her strategy to match up with her opponent and target weaknesses of those opponents. And behind all that is her finish ability, which can come in as an explosive strike or even a quick submission. Starting with her ground game, she carries a 2.51 takedown average with both a consistent presence in her fights and the ability to stack them for huge chunks of control time. Not to mention the submission ability that lurks around. She is pretty consistent with the attempts, but actually landing one is a bit less consistent. Striking is solid and serves as another threat in fights, working with a 5.66 to 3.15. Very solid style, which is able to minimize the damage coming back while constantly applying some pressure. She's also capable of sudden explosive moments, which can catch fighters off guard and end that fight in an instant. Coupling all that with a ground game results in fighters being on the back foot and being forced to fight from behind. Suarez is more of a finisher with a bit of a ground focus, though she does have a KO win in the UFC. A 6.20 takedown average highlights that fact. She is more than able to stack the takedowns and doesn't have a single UFC fight where she's had less than 2 landed takedowns. As a result, she gains chunks of control with regularity and can control the pace of a fight easily. Her submissions are the biggest threat, and she has been able to land them with regular consistency. Striking backs it up with a 4.27 to 1.38, though in part that is assisted by her ability to slow the fight down and limit her opponent's offense. Vegas has this fight close in favor of Suarez. And deciding live, I'm going to disagree. I think Suarez can win this fight. Looking at her numbers, she's a submission threat, and those fights can end quick. A single mistake by Welly, and suddenly she's in an ankle hook or something. But Welly has done such a very good job in her fights of matching up with her opponents and being able to survive her opponent's moments. And Welly has a decent ground game, has proven the ability to stifle takedowns or at least lessen their impact and survive ground games. Suarez is dangerous on the ground, yes, but we've seen Welly fight a lot of ground-focused fighters that pose threats. She's been able to come out on top. She's been able to work a game plan. She's been able to win the fight over 5 rounds. Would I be surprised if Suarez won? No. But I think Welly has the slight edge in my mind with her experience and what we've seen from her in regards to adjusting a game plan and while we've seen her match up with other kind of ground-focused fighters in this division. And for the main event and the middleweight title, 22-2, Driscus still knocks du Plessis. Looks to keep his belt against the challenger and the former champion, 29-6, Sean Tarzan Strickland. Du Plessis is 2 years younger with either dead even height or 1 inch going to Strickland with dead even reach across the board. Du Plessis, like a few other fighters on this card, is a bit weird to pin down. I am going to call him a finisher with the majority of his UFC wins coming by finish. He's a power-focused fighter who excels in mauling his opponents and constantly applying pressure, which grows in effectiveness as the fight goes. You see this now. He really only has 1 first-round finish in the UFC. His striking shows this off. A 6.18 to 4.85 where he racks up the damage over rounds, dragging his opponent into the deep end before finishing them off. He has a good deal of durability, which has paid off, as fighters like Sean Strickland and Israel Adesanya were able to beat him in strikes, though he won both of these fights. You also see that in his takedown game with a 3.04 takedown average and its consistent presence in his fights. In his last 2 fights combined, he had 10 total takedowns, though those only combined for a total of 5 minutes of ground control. His takedowns are more so disruption to force scrambles to let him deal damage to his opponent and make them tired while they get back to their feet. He does like to lead the action, but has proven the ability to survive and get back to his feet. Strickland is still an odd fighter to describe well, but the best I can do is call him a striking-focused grinder. He works a 6.01 to 4.48 on the feet, which shows his ability to have a high output of strikes. What it doesn't show is how his style messes with his opponent. He walks you down and keeps you right in front of him, bringing the strikes from range and odd angles, forcing you to work around him to generate anything. Now, he can be caught and mashed on the feet, but it's not common. The takedown game he has sits at a 0.78, and something that really only pops up as a recovery tool, because he hasn't landed one since 2022. He does have some lurking KO power and has knocked out fighters before, but it isn't really a consistent facet of his game. Vegas likes du Plessis, but has the fight very close, which is fair, but I am going to go with du Plessis here and agree with Vegas. This is a rematch, so obviously that plays a role in this, but I think du Plessis still matches up really well. He's constantly advancing, applying pressure, and he's very aggressive with powerful takedowns. Landing those puts the pressure on Strickland, gives him control time, and kind of makes Strickland expend a lot of effort and makes him tired. Strickland likes to live behind his jab and fighting at range, but with equal reach across both fighters and fairly equal power across both fighters, Strickland's ability to fight at range gets a little negated. And when he's taken down and forced to fight off the ground, he gets more exhausted and more points go to du Plessis. I think du Plessis just has the best recipe here to win, being that we've seen this fight once, and I don't know if it's going to play out any different. Could Strickland win? Yes. He has the ability to do that grinding striking very well, where he can screw up his opponent's offense and mess up their rhythm. But at the same time, du Plessis will walk forward into hit. He doesn't mind getting outpaced on the feet. He'll match up and he'll go for it. We saw it in his last 2 fights against Adesanya and Strickland. He was outstruck, but relied on the control time and the takedowns to kind of cement a victory. But in the end, that's UFC 312. And I hope you all can see what I mean where I say the outcomes of this card will be really exciting. We'll see where a lot of fighters stand, whether the newcomers are worth something or they need a little bit more time to develop, whether some fighters are ready to take that next step and enter the next echelon, or whether they're not there yet or maybe they won't be there. And the 2 title fights really do carry a lot of this card. They're very interesting. The rematch of du Plessis and Strickland is fun. and Zhang Tatiana Suarez. That looks to be a fun fight that might shake that women's division up. But in the end, that's all I got. So go ahead, leave a comment, leave a like, do whatever you want, and have a great fight.